the story is told about the Kerry man. In Ireland, we tell stories about people in Kerry, no harm intended, and no Kerry man was injured in making of this story. The story is told about the Kerry man who was on his holidays or vacation in London, and he walked down along beside the banks of the River Thames, and he saw a Baptist preacher down at the water's edge, surrounded by people. Being curious, he went closer to find out what the preacher was talking about. He was telling his listeners and asking them if they wanted to be saved. And if they said yes, he would dip their head in the water and ask them if they had found Jesus. So the Kerry man decided, well, he'd have some of this. What harm could it possibly do? So he went and stood beside the preacher, and the preacher asked him, did he want to be saved? And he said yes. And then he got him and placed his head under the water and lifted him out and asked him, did you find Jesus? And he said no. So he tried again and dipped his head under the water and pulled him out and said, did you find Jesus? And he said no. Now the preacher was very perplexed. His reputation was on the line here. So he got him a third time and placed his head under the water. This time he waited until the bubbles almost stopped. And when he pulled him out, he said, did you find Jesus? And the Kerry man said, are you sure he fell in here? That man in the story wanted to be involved in what was happening on the banks of the River Thames. What would you have done? Have you ever did things that left you feeling a little bit out of your depth? Did you ever say something that you regretted afterwards? Or do something that you felt maybe I shouldn't have done? If so, you're in good company, because Simon Peter was a little bit like that. He missed many opportunities to say nothing. We can remember him also doing things that he might not have done. I remember Jesus, he brought the coin with Caesar's head on it to Jesus, and Jesus said, well, if you want to pay taxes, give it back to Caesar. His head is on it. Today, we have another opportunity when maybe Jesus or St. Peter is out of his depth. He almost drowns. And you know the story. We've just listened to it again. It takes place immediately after Jesus has fed the 5,000 people. Jesus has still not had time to grieve over the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. So he sends the disciples away to the other side of the river. He's going to dismiss the 5,000 himself, and then he wants to go and offer a prayer. Later that night, he's there alone, but the boat is out on the water, battling a headwind and heavy waves. Shortly before dawn, Jesus goes to disciples, and as St. Matthew tells us, he does so walking on the water. We can only imagine how terrified the disciples must have been. It's a ghost, they said. We couldn't blame them. Ordinary people don't walk on water. Of course, this minor episode in Jesus' life has been the target of much humour. There is the time-honoured story about the Scotsman, a man from Scotland who was on vacation in the Holy Land. The Scottish people were renowned for being financially careful. When he got to the Sea of Galilee, he was going to do a tour of the Sea of Galilee in a boat, and he found out that it cost $50 to hire the boat for an hour. And he said to the man renting the boat, "In Scotland, I could get that boat for just $20. "That might be true," said the boatman, "but you have to take into account that this is the Sea of Galilee, and this is the water on which the Lord walked." To which the Scotman replied, "At $50 an hour for a boat, it's no surprise that he walked." Today, Jesus walked on the water. Jesus, aware that his disciples were afraid, tried to calm them. "Take courage," he said, "don't be afraid, it is I." And of course it was Simon Peter who spoke up, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come across the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Matthew tells us that Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. I could imagine Peter saying to himself, "This is great. I'm doing it. Look at me. I can do it. I'm walking on water." But as soon as he felt the wind blowing on his face, seeing the waves splashing around his feet, he took fright, began to sink, and cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus did reach out and save him and said, "Why did you have so little faith?" I could imagine Jesus had a lovely smile on his face as he saved Peter from sinking into the water. He climbed into the boat, and the water and the wind and the waves died down again. Those who were in the boat, the closing line of today's gospel, worshipped Jesus. "Truly you are the Son of God." And truly Jesus is the Son of God. And that's why we gather here each Sunday. That's why we come to listen to his word. Perhaps we also would like to be involved in the story, like Simon Peter. We would like to do something. Sometimes you just have to become involved. Sometimes you have to do something, even if unusual. That was the advice of Dr. Robert Sims, who told of a retired man here from California who made a splash some years ago. He seems to have decided to tie some helium balloons to his lawn chair in order to go for a ride. After he tied on a few balloons, the chair started to lift off the ground. So he got his neighbours to hold it down while he proceeded to tie on another 30 or 40 balloons. When he had enough balloons, he sat in the chair, strapped himself in, and asked the neighbours to let go. He expected the chair would only go 10 or 20 feet, and he had a sharp stick so he could pop the balloons and land safely. But he didn't land so safely. Around that same time, a plane landing in LAX reported to air traffic control that they had passed somebody in a lawn chair at 3,500 feet. Maybe the man in the chair was right. You just have to do something. Try it out. I believe that that's what makes Simon Peter so attractive. He wasn't the kind of individual to sit around and reflect on things. He wasn't the kind who thought for too long. He became involved, and that got him in a little bit of trouble from time to time. But at least he lived by his convictions, and today we find him in the water where the action is. That's very refreshing. Most followers of the Lord tend to be more cautious people. We don't tend to get out of the boat. Notice that the other disciples who didn't join him in this little adventure, for example, James and John, often described as the sons of thunder, they didn't get their feet wet today. The existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once described a decision to follow Jesus as a leap of faith, like jumping off a cliff. Maybe that's why so few of us want to follow Christ as radically. We're not into cliff jumping. We're nice people. We're sweet people. We wouldn't hurt a fly. We were brought up to respect the rights of others. We tried to keep the 10 Commandments and a few other laws as well. We've no major vices, but maybe no major virtues either. Notice that it's only when St. Peter takes his eyes off the Lord that he begins to sink. That's how it is as a follower of Jesus too. As long as we're focused on our faith, we're okay. But when we focus on our fears, the task can become too much. If I was to take a 10-foot long plank and place it on the ground along the middle aisle and ask if there was anybody prepared to walk the plank, I'm sure most people would say, yes, I could do that. If that plank were to be lifted 50 feet above the floor and I asked, does anybody want to walk the plank now? I'd say it would be more difficult to get volunteers. The same thing happened to St. Peter. When he became aware of the waves, the water, maybe thought about the amount of water beneath him and the absurdity of his situation, he began to sink, and he could have drowned. Sometimes things like that can happen in church life too. A small group of people can have a dream of something they might like to do for their parish. They feel that it's inspired by the Lord. Soon they have a plan, and when the plan begins to take roots, others take hope and decide to become involved too. And winning a wonderful future begins to take shape. But then the inevitable happens. Opposition materializes somewhere in the congregation. It's very expensive. It's too radical. It'll bankrupt the church. And you know, Mr. So-and-so doesn't approve. And if he leaves the church, he'll take his money with him. And soon, plans begin to falter. Easier to have peace than to cause waves. And so, the plan comes to nothing. As a well-known bishop put it so well, most churches will die of boredom before dying of controversy. So what is the challenge of today's scriptures? The challenge of today's scriptures is to become involved, to dare to dream, to become involved in the life of Holy Family Parish in whatever way you can. If our focus is the Lord, we can't go wrong. Today's challenge is that we put our feet into the water. Lord, guide our steps.